That's all it took for Ethan Cole to know someone was dying on Blackwood land tonight. The neighbors said, "Stay away." The law said, "Mind your business." But when that second scream tore through the Montana dusk, raw, desperate, fighting, Ethan didn't think. He rode straight into hell itself, toward that old barn where lamplight flickered like a demon's eye. The door was barred from the outside. Someone wanted her trapped. Someone wanted her silenced. Ethan ripped that beam away and kicked the door open. "She's free now," he said. But freedom in Montana territory? That's just where the war begins. If you want to see how far courage can take two strangers in a lawless land, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The valley looked peaceful that evening, the kind of peace that tricks a man into thinking the world is soft. The sun was dropping behind the Rockies, painting the grasslands in shades of rust and gold, and the wind carried the smell of sage and creek water. Ethan Cole had been mending fence on the eastern ridge of his ranch when he heard the first gunshot crack across the distance. He froze, hammer in hand, and listened. Nothing. Then came the second shot, and then the scream. It wasn't the sound of an animal caught in a trap. It wasn't the holler of cowhands roughhousing after whiskey. This was a woman's voice, shrill and ragged, ripping through the evening like something had gone terribly, brutally wrong. Ethan dropped his tools and ran for his horse. His mare, a sturdy buckskin named Tally, sensed his urgency and didn't fight the bit. He swung into the saddle and kicked her into a gallop, tearing down the ridge toward the source of the sound. His ranch bordered the old Hale property to the north, land that had been quiet for 2 years since Samuel Hale died. But 3 months ago, a man named Cyrus Blackwood had moved in, claiming ownership through some deed nobody in town could verify. Blackwood kept to himself, hired rough men, and made it clear that neighbors weren't welcome. Ethan had honored that distance. Until now. The scream came again, and this time he could pinpoint it. The big barn on the northern edge of Blackwood's land, maybe a half-mile out. Tally's hooves pounded the earth, and Ethan leaned low in the saddle, his heart hammering. He didn't know what he was riding into, didn't know if he'd find a man beating his wife, a horse gone wild, or something worse. But he knew the sound of fear, and he knew the sound of someone fighting to stay alive. When he crested the final hill, he saw it. The barn, weather-beaten and listing slightly to the east, lamplight seeping through the cracks in the wood. 2 horses stood tied to a post outside. A man's shadow moved inside, visible through the gaps. And the door was barred from the outside. Ethan pulled Tally to a hard stop and dismounted in one motion, his boots hitting the dirt before the mare had fully settled. He scanned the area. No one in sight. Just the wind, the lamplight, and that damn bar across the barn door, thick as a man's arm, holding someone prisoner inside. He grabbed the beam with both hands and heaved it upward. It was heavy, solid oak, wedged tight into iron brackets. Whoever had set it there wanted to make sure no one was getting out without help. "Hold on!" Ethan shouted, though he didn't know if anyone could hear him over the chaos inside. The beam gave way with a groan, and Ethan threw it aside. He grabbed the door handle, yanked it open, and stepped into smoke and madness. The first thing he saw was fire. A lantern had been knocked over, spilling oil across the hay-strewn floor. Flames were climbing the nearest stall, crackling and hungry. The second thing he saw was a man with a pistol in his hand, standing over a woman who was backed into the far corner, her dress torn, her face streaked with soot and blood. "Get the hell out!" the man roared, swinging the gun toward Ethan. Ethan didn't stop moving. He lunged forward, closing the distance before the man could aim properly, and drove his shoulder into the bastard's chest. They hit the ground hard, and the pistol went skittering across the floor. The man was bigger than Ethan, heavier, with a face like a bulldog and fists to match. He threw a wild punch that caught Ethan on the jaw, snapping his head back, but Ethan rolled with it and came up swinging. His first punch landed square on the man's nose, and he felt the crunch of cartilage. Blood sprayed. The man howled and swung again, but Ethan ducked and drove a knee into his ribs. The air went out of him in a wet gasp, and Ethan shoved him backward into the burning stall. "Run!" Ethan shouted to the woman. "Get out! Now!" She didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled to her feet and bolted for the door, limping but moving fast. Ethan followed, but the man grabbed his ankle and yanked him down. They hit the floor together. grappling in the smoke, and Ethan could feel the heat of the fire growing closer, the smoke filling his lungs. He twisted, broke the man's grip, and drove an elbow into his temple. The man's eyes rolled back and he went slack. Ethan didn't wait to see if he was out cold or just dazed. He grabbed the woman's fallen shawl from the floor and threw it over the flames to smother the worst of it, then staggered out of the barn into the cool evening air. The woman was on her knees in the dirt, coughing hard, her hands pressed to her chest. Ethan dropped beside her, breathing heavy, his face smeared with soot. "You all right?" he asked. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw her clearly. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins and eyes that were wide with shock but sharp underneath. There was a bruise forming on her cheekbone, and her lower lip was split, but she was breathing. She was alive. Who are you?" she managed, her voice hoarse. "Name's Ethan Cole. I own the ranch south of here." He glanced back at the barn where smoke was still pouring out the door. "We need to move. That man still in there?" She nodded, then shook her head, confused. "I don't know. He locked me in, said I wasn't leaving until I signed the papers." Ethan frowned. "What papers?" Before she could answer, the barn door flew open and the man stumbled out, blood streaming from his nose, his eyes wild with rage. He had the pistol again. "You son of a bitch!" he snarled, raising the gun. Ethan threw himself in front of the woman just as the shot rang out. The bullet whined past his ear, so close he felt the heat of it, and buried itself in the dirt behind them. He grabbed the woman's arm and hauled her to her feet. "Move!" They ran for the horses. Tally was still there, tossing her head nervously, and Ethan practically threw the woman into the saddle before vaulting up behind her. Another shot cracked through the air, and this one hit the fence post beside them, splintering wood. Ethan dug his heels into Tally's sides, and the mare bolted. They raced across the darkening prairie, the wind whipping past them, and Ethan could hear the man shouting behind them, but no more shots came. Either he was out of bullets or smart enough to know he couldn't hit a moving target in the fading light. Ethan didn't care which. He just rode. They didn't stop until they were well onto Ethan's land, until the lights of his small ranch house came into view and he was sure they weren't being followed. Only then did he slow Tally to a walk and let the woman slide down from the saddle. She stumbled, and he caught her before she fell. "Easy," he said. "You're safe now." She looked up at him, and in the moonlight, he saw tears streaking through the soot on her face. "Safe?" she whispered. "I'll never be safe. Not as long as he's alive." Ethan's ranch was modest, a small cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that was more functional than pretty, and a corral that held 2 other horses and a milk cow. He'd built it himself 5 years ago, after leaving a life of drifting and deciding Montana was as good a place as any to put down roots. It wasn't much, but it was his, and it was honest work. He led the woman inside and lit a lamp on the table. The cabin was one large room with a kitchen area on one side, a bed in the corner, and a fireplace that doubled as a stove. It smelled like coffee and leather and wood smoke. "Sit," he said, pulling out a chair. She did, slowly, as if every movement hurt. He poured water from a pitcher into a basin and brought it over with a clean cloth. "Let me see that cut," he said, nodding to her lip. She flinched when he touched the cloth to her face, but she didn't pull away. He worked carefully, cleaning the blood and dirt, and she watched him the whole time with those sharp eyes. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Risk your life for a stranger." "Couldn't exactly leave you there," Ethan replied. "Most men would have." He met her gaze. "I'm not most men." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "No, I don't suppose you are." He set the cloth aside and pulled up a chair across from her. "You want to tell me what that was about? Who was that man, and why'd he lock you in a burning barn?" She took a shaky breath and folded her hands in her lap. "My name is Lydia Hale. That land, where you found me, it belonged to my father, Samuel Hale." Ethan's brows rose. "Samuel Hale? He's been dead 2 years." "I know. I was back east when he died, Philadelphia. I was finishing school." Her voice was bitter. "By the time I got word, it was too late. The funeral was over and a man named Cyrus Blackwood had already moved onto the property, claiming my father sold it to him before he died." Did he? No. The word was sharp, definite. My father would never have sold that land. It's been in our family for 20 years. He built that ranch with his own hands, raised cattle, raised me. That land was everything to him. Ethan leaned back in his chair. So what'd you do? I came back 3 months ago. I thought I could reason with Blackwood, show him the truth. But when I arrived, he laughed in my face. Said he had a deed, signed and witnessed, and there was nothing I could do about it. I tried going to the sheriff, but Blackwood's paid him off. I tried going to the land office, but the clerk said the deed was registered and legal. So you went back to confront him? She nodded. I went to the house, my house, and I demanded to see the deed. He refused. We argued. He said if I kept making trouble, I'd regret it, so I waited until he left and I broke into his office. Ethan whistled low. That was bold. It was stupid, she corrected, but I had to know. And I found something hidden in a drawer. Letters, dozens of them, between Blackwood and some man in Helena. They were talking about my land, about what's under it. Under it? Lydia leaned forward, her voice urgent now. Gold, Ethan. Or silver. I'm not sure. But they found something valuable on that land, and they wanted it. The letters talked about getting my father out of the way, about forging documents, about making sure no one questioned the sale. Ethan felt his gut tighten. You're saying they killed him. I'm saying I don't know how he died. The doctor said it was his heart, but my father was strong, healthy, and now I've seen those letters, and I know Blackwood is a liar and a thief, and I don't believe in coincidences. She reached into the torn pocket of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper, stained and crumpled but still intact. I took one of the letters. I was going to take it to the marshal in Helena, someone outside Blackwood's reach, but he caught me before I could leave. He dragged me to the barn, said he'd burn the letter and me with it if I didn't sign a paper saying I gave up all claim to the land. Ethan took the letter from her and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, but the words were clear enough. Blackwood. The assay confirms high-grade ore in the northern section. Hale doesn't suspect. Proceed as planned. Make it look natural. We can't afford questions. T.G. Ethan's jaw tightened. This is evidence of murder. It's evidence of something, Lydia said, but without more, it's not enough. Blackwood will deny it, say the letter's a forgery, say I'm a bitter daughter trying to get revenge. I need the rest of the letters. I need proof. Where are they? In his office, in that drawer. She looked at him, and he saw desperation in her eyes. I have to go back. The hell you do, Ethan said flatly. You go back there, and he'll kill you for real this time. Then what do you suggest? Her voice rose, sharp with frustration. I can't just let him take everything my father built. I can't let him get away with murder. You won't, Ethan said, but you're not going back there alone. She blinked. You'd help me? Already did, didn't I? He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the dark prairie. Blackwood knows I pulled you out of that barn. He got a good look at me, and he knows where I live. He's not going to let this go, so we've got two choices, run or fight. I'm not running, Lydia said fiercely. Ethan turned back to her and nodded. Good. Neither am I, Mads. They spent the next hour planning. Lydia drew a rough map of the house on a scrap of paper, where Blackwood's office was, where his men usually slept, where the doors and windows were. Ethan listened, asked questions, and thought through the angles. It wasn't going to be easy. Blackwood had at least 4 men working for him, maybe more, and they were the kind of men who carried guns and knew how to use them. We'll need the law on our side eventually, Ethan said. Even if the local sheriff's crooked, the marshal in Helena isn't. But we need solid proof first. Those letters, the original deed if we can find it, anything that ties Blackwood to your father's death. Lydia nodded. The letters are in a locked drawer in his desk. I picked the lock once. I can do it again. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You pick locks? A faint smile crossed her face, the first he'd seen. I had a misspent youth. Good to know. He stood and moved to a cabinet in the corner, pulling out a gun belt and checking the revolver. We'll go tomorrow night. Gives us a day to rest and scout the area. Blackwood will be expecting trouble, so we'll need to be smart. Why are you doing this? Lydia asked suddenly. Ethan paused and looked at her. What do you mean? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. You could have left me in that barn, or you could have dropped me at the sheriff's office and walked away. But you're risking your life, your ranch, everything. Why? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he holstered the revolver and sat back down across from her. My father was a gambler, a drunk. He lost everything we had, our farm, our animals, my mother's wedding ring. When I was 15, he tried to sell me to a work crew to pay off his debts. I ran, spent 10 years drifting, working cattle drives, getting into fights, trying to figure out who I was. And then one day, I met a man who gave me a job when I didn't deserve one, taught me how to build something instead of just taking from others. He didn't have to do it, but he did. And it changed my life. He met Lydia's eyes. I'm not leaving you to burn because some bastard wants your land. That's not the kind of man I am anymore. That's not the kind of world I want to live in. Lydia's throat worked, and she blinked hard, as if fighting back tears. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, Ethan said. We've got a long road ahead. Oops. That night, Lydia slept in Ethan's bed. He insisted, while he took a bedroll on the floor near the fireplace. He didn't sleep much. Every creak of the cabin, every sound from outside, had him reaching for his gun. He knew Blackwood wouldn't come tonight. The man was smart enough to regroup and plan. But that didn't mean Ethan could let his guard down. Just before dawn, he heard Lydia stir. He glanced over and saw her sitting up, her hair tangled around her shoulders, staring at the small window above the bed. Can't sleep? He asked quietly. She shook her head. Every time I close my eyes, I see him. I see the fire. I see my father's grave, and I wonder if he knew what was coming. Ethan sat up and leaned against the wall. You think Blackwood killed him? I don't know, she admitted. But I know my father didn't just sell that land and die. He wouldn't have. And if Blackwood did kill him, her voice hardened, then I'm going to make sure he pays. We will, Ethan said. Together. She looked at him, and something shifted in her expression, something grateful and fierce all at once. You're a good man, Ethan Cole. I'm a man who's trying, he said. That's all any of us can do. The next day they prepared. Ethan rode into the small town of Coldwater, 5 miles south, and bought supplies, rope, lamp oil, ammunition. He asked careful questions at the general store, listening to gossip about Blackwood and his men. What he heard wasn't encouraging. Blackwood had money, influence, and a reputation for being ruthless. The townsfolk were afraid of him. When Ethan got back to the ranch, he found Lydia outside, practicing with an old rifle he'd left in the barn. You know how to shoot? He called. She lowered the rifle and turned to him. My father taught me. Said a woman in Montana Territory needed to know how to protect herself. Smart man. She smiled sadly. He was. That evening, they went over the plan one more time. They'd wait until after midnight, when Blackwood's men would be asleep or drunk. They'd approach from the east, where the trees provided cover, and slip in through the kitchen door. Lydia said it was usually unlocked. Once inside, they'd head straight for the office, grab the letters and any other evidence they could find, and get out before anyone noticed. It was a simple plan. Maybe too simple, but it was all they had. Midnight came cold and clear, the moon a thin crescent barely lighting the prairie. Ethan and Lydia rode together on Tally, moving slowly to avoid noise, keeping to the low ground where the shadows were deepest. When they reached the edge of Blackwood's property, they dismounted and tied the mare to a tree. Stay close, Ethan whispered, and if something goes wrong, you run. Don't wait for me. I'm not leaving you, Lydia said firmly. Lydia, I'm not leaving you, she repeated, and the look in her eyes told him there was no point arguing. They moved through the trees, low and quiet, until they could see the house. It was a 2-story structure bigger than Ethan's cabin, with a wide porch and lamplight glowing in a few of the windows. The barn was dark, still smelling faintly of smoke from the fire the night before. They approached the kitchen door, and Lydia tried the handle. It turned. She looked at Ethan, and he nodded. They slipped inside. The kitchen was dark and quiet, smelling of coffee and fried meat. They moved through it carefully, avoiding the creaky floorboards, and made their way down a narrow hallway toward the office. Ethan could hear voices upstairs, men laughing, the clink of bottles. His hand hovered near his revolver. The office door was closed, but not locked. Lydia opened it slowly, and they stepped inside. The room was lined with bookshelves, a large desk dominating the center. Lydia went straight to the desk and knelt, pulling a hairpin from her hair and working it into the lock on the bottom drawer. Ethan kept watch at the door, his heart pounding. Every second felt like an hour. "Come on," Lydia whispered, her hands shaking as she worked the lock. There was a soft click, and the drawer opened. She reached inside and pulled out a bundle of letters tied with string, along with a folded document. "I've got them," she breathed. "Good. Let's go." But as they turned toward the door, the floorboards in the hallway creaked. Ethan froze. Footsteps. Coming closer. "Hide," he hissed. Lydia dove behind the desk, clutching the letters. Ethan pressed himself against the wall beside the door, his hand on his gun. The door swung open and a man stepped in, one of Blackwood's hired guns carrying a lantern. The man saw Ethan a second too late. Ethan grabbed the lantern and smashed it into the man's face. Glass shattered, oil sprayed, and the man went down with a shout. But the damage was done. The shout echoed through the house, and within seconds, Ethan heard boots pounding on the stairs. "Go!" Ethan yelled. Lydia bolted from behind the desk and ran for the window. Ethan followed, firing a shot down the hallway to slow the approaching men, then dove through the window after her. They hit the ground hard, rolled, and came up running. Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets whining through the air. Ethan grabbed Lydia's hand and they sprinted for the trees, the night exploding with chaos and noise. Behind them, he could hear Blackwood's voice roaring orders, could hear men mounting horses. They reached Tally, and Ethan practically threw Lydia into the saddle before swinging up behind her. He kicked the mare into a dead run, and they tore through the darkness, the sound of pursuit close behind. "Did you get them?" Ethan shouted over the wind. Lydia held up the bundle of letters, clutched tight in her fist. "I got them," Ethan grinned despite the danger. "Then let's finish this." They rode hard through the night, not toward Ethan's ranch, but toward Coldwater, toward the telegraph office and the law that couldn't be bought. Behind them, the chase continued, but Ethan knew these lands better than Blackwood's men. He knew the hidden trails, the shortcuts, the places where a good horse could lose a dozen riders. By the time the sun rose, they were standing in front of the marshal's office in Helena, 50 miles north, with a bundle of letters that would bring down a killer. Cyrus Blackwood's reign was over, and Lydia Hale was finally free. The marshal's office in Helena sat on a dusty corner of Main Street, sandwiched between a hardware store and a saloon that never seemed to close. It was a sturdy brick building with iron bars on the windows and a sign that hung slightly crooked, reading U.S. Marshal, Montana Territory. Ethan and Lydia stumbled through the door just as the morning sun was burning off the last of the night's cold, their clothes torn and filthy, their faces drawn with exhaustion. A clerk looked up from behind a desk, his eyes widening at the sight of them. "We need to see the marshal," Ethan said, his voice rough from writing and shouting. "Now." "He's not now," Ethan repeated, and something in his tone made the clerk abandon whatever excuse he'd been forming. He disappeared through a back door and returned moments later with a tall man in his 50s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a marshal's badge on his vest. "I'm Marshal Warren Gray," the man said, his gaze moving between them. "And you two look like you've been through hell." "Close enough," Lydia said. She stepped forward and placed the bundle of letters on his desk, along with the folded document she'd taken from Blackwood's drawer. "My name is Lydia Hale. That man, Cyrus Blackwood, murdered my father and stole our land. This is the proof." Gray's expression didn't change, but Ethan saw his eyes sharpen with interest. He picked up the letters, untied the string, and began reading. The office fell silent except for the rustle of paper and the ticking of a clock on the wall. Lydia sank into a chair, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. Ethan stood beside her, one hand resting on the back of her chair, watching the marshal's face. Gray read through 3 letters, then 4, then 5. Finally, he set them down and looked at Lydia. "Where did you get these?" "From Blackwood's office, last night." She met his gaze steadily. He locked me in a barn and tried to burn me alive because I found them. This man," she gestured to Ethan, "saved my life." Gray turned his attention to Ethan. "That true?" "Every word," Ethan said. "Blackwood's got hired guns, a crooked sheriff in his pocket, and he's been sitting on stolen land for 3 months. Those letters talk about an assay, about getting Samuel Hale out of the way, about making it look natural. That's conspiracy to murder, Marshal." Gray leaned back in his chair and studied them both for a long moment. Then he picked up the folded document and opened it. His eyebrows rose. "This is a deed. To the Hale Ranch." "My father's deed," Lydia said. "The real one. It's dated 15 years ago, signed and witnessed properly. Blackwood forged a new one and tried to bury this." Gray set the deed down carefully, as if it were something precious and fragile. "Miss Hale, if what you're telling me is true, this is one of the most brazen land frauds I've seen in 20 years of law work. But I need you to understand something. Cyrus Blackwood is a wealthy man. He's got connections in the territorial government, and he's got lawyers who'll fight this every step of the way. This won't be quick, and it won't be easy." "I don't care," Lydia said fiercely. "I want justice for my father. I want my land back, and I want Blackwood in a cell." Gray nodded slowly. "Then we'll do this right. I'll send a wire to the territorial judge in Virginia City, get a warrant issued for Blackwood's arrest. I'll ride down to Coldwater myself with a deputy, bring him in for questioning. But you two," he pointed at them, "you're going to stay here, in Helena, where it's safe. Blackwood's men will be looking for you, and I don't need any more bodies on my conscience." Ethan started to protest, but Lydia spoke first. "We'll stay," she said quietly, "but only if you promise me you'll bring him in alive. I want to see him face a judge. I want to see him answer for what he did." "You have my word," Gray said. They left the marshal's office an hour later after giving detailed statements and signing affidavits. Gray had arranged for them to stay at a boarding house on the edge of town, a modest place run by a widow named Mrs. Callahan, who asked no questions and served hot meals. Ethan paid for 2 rooms, though he barely had enough coin left to cover it, and they spent the rest of that day sleeping off the exhaustion of the past 48 hours. When Ethan woke, it was late afternoon, and the sun was slanting through the window of his small room. He washed his face in the basin, changed into a clean shirt Mrs. Callahan had lent him, and went downstairs to find Lydia sitting in the parlor, staring out the window at the street. "You get any rest?" he asked. She nodded, but didn't look at him. "Some. I keep thinking about what happens next." Ethan sat down in the chair across from her. "Gray's good at his job. He'll bring Blackwood in." "And then what?" She finally turned to look at him, and he saw the worry in her eyes. "Even if we prove Blackwood forged the deed, even if we prove he killed my father, what's to stop his men from coming after us? What's to stop them from burning down what's left of the ranch? Or worse?" "We'll deal with it," Ethan said, "one step at a time." "That's easy for you to say. You've got your own land, your own life. I've got nothing but a pile of letters and a dead father's memory." Her voice cracked on the last words, and Ethan saw the tears she'd been holding back finally spill over. She turned away quickly, as if ashamed, but he stood and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "Hey," he said softly, "you're not alone in this." "I feel alone," she whispered. "I felt alone since the day I got the telegram about my father. I came back here thinking I could fix things, thinking I could make it right, and instead I almost died in a barn fire. If you hadn't heard me—" "But I did," Ethan interrupted gently. "And you're here. You're alive. And you're a hell of a lot stronger than you think." She looked at him, her eyes red and shining with tears. "You don't even know me." "I know you picked a lock and stole evidence from a killer's office," Ethan said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "I know you didn't run when you had the chance. I know you're sitting here planning your next move instead of falling apart. That tells me everything I need to know." Lydia let out a shaky laugh and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Ethan Cole." "Probably both," he admitted. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the street drifting through the open window, horses, wagon wheels, voices calling to one another. It was a different kind of quiet than the prairie, busier and more human, but it was comforting in its own way. Finally, Lydia spoke again. When this is over, if we win, I don't know what I'll do. The ranch is in shambles. My father's cattle are gone, sold off or scattered. The house needs repairs. I don't even know if I can manage it on my own. You won't be on your own, Ethan said. She looked at him, surprised. What do you mean? I mean, I'm not going anywhere. Not until you're safe. Not until that land is back in your name. And not until you're ready to stand on your own 2 feet again. And even then, I'll be just over the ridge if you need me. Lydia's breath caught, and for a moment she just stared at him. Then she reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan squeezed back. You don't have to keep thanking me, Lydia. I'm doing this because it's right, and because I think you deserve better than what you've been given. She held his gaze for a long moment, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a connection forged in fire and fear, and the shared determination to see justice done. Then she let go of his hand and stood, wiping her eyes one last time. I should wash up before dinner, she said, her voice steadier now. Mrs. Callahan said she's making stew. Ethan nodded and watched her go, feeling the weight of everything they still had to face settling onto his shoulders. But for the first time since he'd heard that scream in the barn, he felt something else, too. Hope. Marshal Gray rode out the next morning with 2 deputies, heading south toward Coldwater. He sent word back via telegraph that afternoon. Blackwood had fled. The ranch was empty except for one hired hand who claimed ignorance of any wrongdoing. Gray and his men were pursuing leads, but Blackwood had a head start and money enough to disappear if he wanted to. The news hit Lydia hard. She paced the small parlor of the boarding house, her hands clenched into fists. He's running, she said, her voice tight with anger. He knows we have the evidence, and he's running. He won't get far, Ethan said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Men like Blackwood had ways of vanishing, especially if they had friends in high places. He's going to get away with it, Lydia said bitterly. He's going to get away with killing my father, stealing my land, and trying to kill me, and there's nothing we can do about it. That's not true, Ethan said firmly. He stood and took her by the shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Gray's a good marshal. He'll find Blackwood. And even if he doesn't, we've still got the letters, the deed, the proof. Blackwood can run, but he can't undo what we've already done. Your land is yours, Lydia. Legally, morally, every way that matters. No one can take that from you now. She searched his face, and slowly, the tension in her body eased. You really believe that? I do. She took a deep breath and nodded. All right. Then we wait. But if Gray doesn't find him, if Blackwood slips away, I need to know you'll help me go after him myself. Ethan hesitated. The smart thing would be to say no, to tell her to let the law handle it. But he looked into her eyes and saw the same fire that had driven her to break into Blackwood's office, to risk everything for the truth. He couldn't extinguish that fire. He wouldn't. If it comes to that, he said quietly, I'll help you. But let's hope it doesn't. 3 days passed. Gray sent another telegram. He'd tracked Blackwood to a mining camp near Butte, but the man had slipped away again before they could arrest him. The marshal was expanding the search, bringing in federal assistance, but it was slow work. Ethan and Lydia settled into an uneasy routine at the boarding house. They ate meals together, took walks through Helena to pass the time, and talked about everything and nothing. Her life back east, his years drifting, the kind of future they both hoped to build. It was strange, Ethan thought, how quickly they'd become comfortable with each other, as if the shared danger had stripped away all the usual walls people put up. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the boarding house watching the sun set over the mountains, Lydia asked him something she'd been wondering since the night he'd saved her. Why don't you have a family, Ethan? A wife? Children? You're a good man and you've got land. Most men your age are settled by now. Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. I was engaged once, back in Wyoming, about 7 years ago. Her name was Anna. We were going to get married in the spring, start a life together. But that winter was hard. Blizzards, cattle dying, food running short. I was working a ranch then, not my own. and the owner was a bastard who didn't care if his men starved as long as his cattle got fed. I got into a fight with him over it, and he fired me. Anna's father said I wasn't stable enough, that I couldn't provide for her. He convinced her to break it off. "I'm sorry," Lydia said softly. Ethan shrugged. "It was a long time ago. I drifted for a while after that, worked cattle drives, saved every penny I could. Eventually I ended up in Montana and bought my land. I told myself I'd build something solid, something no one could take away. And I did. But I never got around to finding someone to share it with." "Why not?" He looked at her, and the honesty in her eyes made him answer more truthfully than he'd intended. "Because I didn't think I deserved it. I came from nothing, Lydia. My father was a drunk and a failure, and for a long time I thought that's all I'd ever be. It took me years to realize I could be something different. By then, I guess I'd gotten used to being alone." Lydia reached over and touched his hand. "You're not alone anymore." Ethan turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. "Neither are you." They sat like that for a while, hand in hand, as the sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan let himself imagine what it might be like to have someone by his side, not out of necessity or convenience, but because they chose to be there. On the fourth day, everything changed. A rider came thundering into Helena just after dawn, his horse lathered and wild-eyed. He went straight to the marshal's office, and within an hour, word had spread through the town. Cyrus Blackwood had been spotted in Coldwater. He'd returned to the ranch with a group of armed men, barricaded himself inside the house, and was refusing to surrender. Ethan heard the news from Mrs. Callahan, who'd heard it from the postmaster, who'd heard it from the rider himself. He found Lydia in her room, packing her few belongings into a saddlebag. "You heard?" she asked without looking up. "I heard. And you're not going." "Like hell I'm not." She turned to face him, her jaw set. "He's on my land, Ethan, in my father's house. I'm going." "Gray said to stay here." "I don't care what Gray said. That's my home. And if there's going to be a fight, I'm going to be part of it." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to lock her in the room if he had to, but he knew it would be pointless. Lydia Hale was the most stubborn woman he'd ever met, and he'd learned enough about her in the past few days to know that once she made up her mind, there was no changing it. "Fine," he said, "but we do this smart. We ride with Gray and his deputies, we follow their lead, and we don't do anything stupid. Agreed?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Agreed." They found Gray at the marshal's office, organizing a posse. He wasn't happy to see them, but he didn't waste time arguing. "You two stay back when we get there," he said curtly. "I don't need civilians getting shot." "That's my land," Lydia said. "I have a right to be there." Gray gave her a long look, then sighed. "Fine, but you stay with me, and you do exactly what I say. Understood?" "Understood." They rode out within the hour. Gray, his two deputies, Ethan, Lydia, and 4 men from Helena who'd volunteered for the posse. It was a hard ride south, covering ground fast, and they reached Coldwater by late afternoon. The town was tense, the streets nearly empty. The sheriff, a weasel-faced man named Keller, met them at the edge of town with his hands up in a gesture of peace. "Marshal," he said, his voice oily, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Shut your mouth, Keller," Gray said flatly. "You're lucky I don't arrest you right now for aiding a fugitive." "Where is he?" Keller swallowed hard. "At the Hale Ranch. He's got maybe 6, 7 men with him. They've got rifles, Marshal. They're not going to come quiet." "Then we'll do it loud," Gray said. He turned to his men. "Check your weapons. We're going in." They rode the last 2 miles in silence, the sun sinking lower in the sky. As they crested the final hill, Lydia drew in a sharp breath. The ranch spread out below them, her father's ranch, the place she'd grown up. The house looked the same as she remembered, but there were horses tied out front and men with rifles on the porch. "He's really there," she whispered. "And he's about to answer for what he did," Ethan said. Gray raised a hand, signaling the group to stop. They dismounted and spread out, using the cover of the trees and the failing light. Gray cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Cyrus Blackwood! This is U.S. Marshal Warren Gray! You're surrounded! Come out with your hands up!" There was a long silence. Then a voice called back from inside the house, deep and defiant. "Go to hell, Marshal! This is my land, and I'm not leaving." "That land belongs to Lydia Hale. You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and murder. Come out now or we're coming in." Another silence. Then the first shot rang out, splintering a tree trunk 6 inches from Gray's head. The marshal dove for cover and all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from the house, and Gray's men returned fire. Ethan grabbed Lydia and pulled her down behind a fallen log, his revolver in his hand. "Stay down!" he shouted over the noise. "They're going to destroy the house," Lydia cried, watching bullets tear through the walls her father had built. "Better the house than you." Ethan fired twice toward the porch, driving one of Blackwood's men back inside. The fight was chaos, smoke and noise, and the sharp crack of rifles. One of the posse members went down with a bullet in the leg, screaming, and a deputy dragged him back to cover. Gray was shouting orders, trying to coordinate the attack, but Blackwood's men had the advantage of position. They were dug in, and they weren't giving up. Ethan reloaded and glanced at Lydia. Her face was pale but determined, and she was holding the rifle he'd given her with steady hands. "I'm going to circle around," he said. "Try to get to the back of the house. Draw their fire away from Gray." "I'm coming with you," Lydia said immediately. "No, yes." She met his eyes, and he saw the same fierce resolve that had carried her through everything so far. "I'm not letting you go alone." Ethan wanted to argue, but there was no time. He nodded once, and they moved low and fast through the trees, circling wide around the house. The gunfire continued behind them, and Ethan prayed that Gray's men could hold out long enough. They reached the back of the house, where a small door led into the kitchen. Ethan tried the handle, locked. He stepped back and kicked it hard, once, twice, and on the third kick the wood splintered and the door swung open. They slipped inside, moving quickly through the kitchen and into the hallway. The house smelled like gunpowder and sweat, and Ethan could hear men shouting upstairs. He motioned for Lydia to stay close, and they crept toward the staircase. A man appeared at the top of the stairs, rifle in hand. He saw them and swung the barrel toward Lydia. Ethan fired first, and the man dropped, tumbling down the stairs. Ethan grabbed Lydia and pulled her back as more men appeared, but these weren't hired guns. They were running, panicked, trying to get out. "Gray's men are coming in the front," one of them shouted, and they bolted past Ethan and Lydia, fleeing out the back door. Ethan let them go. He wasn't interested in hired hands. He wanted Blackwood. They climbed the stairs, stepping over the dead man, and moved down the hallway. There were 3 doors, all closed. Ethan checked the first 2. Empty. He approached the third and pressed his ear to the wood. He heard movement inside, heavy breathing. He looked at Lydia and mouthed, "Ready?" She nodded. Ethan kicked the door open and rushed in, his gun raised. Cyrus Blackwood stood by the window, his back to them, a pistol in his hand. He turned slowly, and Ethan saw the cold fury in his eyes. "You," Blackwood said, his voice thick with hatred. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you?" "It wasn't his fight," Lydia said, stepping into the room beside Ethan. "It was mine." Blackwood's gaze shifted to her, and he smiled, a cruel, twisted smile. "Little Lydia Hale, I should have killed you in that barn when I had the chance." "Why didn't you?" Lydia asked, her voice steady. "Why did my father have to die?" Blackwood laughed, harsh and bitter. "Your father was a fool, sitting on a fortune and didn't even know it. That land of his, it's got silver running through it, girl, enough to make a man rich for life. But he wouldn't sell, wouldn't even consider it, so I took it." "You murdered him," Lydia said. "I did what needed to be done," Blackwood said coldly, "and I'd do it again. This is Montana territory, girl. Only the strong survive out here. Your father was weak, and you're weaker, but it doesn't matter anymore. This ends tonight." He raised the pistol toward Lydia, and Ethan moved without thinking. He lunged forward, tackling Blackwood just as the gun went off. The bullet went wide, smashing a lamp on the dresser. Ethan and Blackwood hit the floor hard, grappling for the weapon. Blackwood was strong, stronger than Ethan had expected, and he fought like a cornered animal. He drove a knee into Ethan's ribs, and pain exploded through his chest. Ethan gasped but held on, twisting Blackwood's wrist until the pistol fell free. Lydia dove for it, her hands closing around the grip. She stood and aimed it at Blackwood, her hands shaking but her eyes clear. "Get off him," she said. Blackwood looked up at her, blood streaming from his nose where Ethan had hit him. You don't have the nerve. Try me, Lydia said quietly. For a long moment, Blackwood stared at her, as if weighing his chances. Then he let go of Ethan and raised his hand slowly. Ethan staggered to his feet, one hand pressed to his ribs, and stood beside Lydia. Footsteps pounded up the stairs, and Gray burst into the room with his deputies, guns drawn. He took in the scene. Blackwood on the floor, Lydia holding the pistol, Ethan bleeding, and his face hardened. Cyrus Blackwood, Gray said, you're under arrest for the murder of Samuel Hale, fraud, attempted murder, and a list of other charges I'm going to enjoy reading to you. Two deputies hauled Blackwood to his feet and cuffed him. As they dragged him toward the door, he looked back at Lydia one last time. You haven't won, he said. You're just a girl playing at being a rancher. You'll lose that land within a year. Lydia lowered the pistol and looked him in the eye. I survived you, she said quietly. I can survive anything. Blackwood's face twisted with rage, but the deputies pulled him out of the room before he could say anything else. Gray turned to Ethan and Lydia, his expression softening. You two all right? Ethan nodded, though his ribs were screaming. We're fine. Gray looked around the room, then back at Lydia. This is your house now, Miss Hale. Legally and rightfully. I'll make sure the paperwork is filed first thing tomorrow. Lydia's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. Thank you, Marshal. Gray tipped his hat. Thank you. You're braver than most men I know. He turned and left, his boots heavy on the stairs. Ethan and Lydia stood alone in the room, the sound of the posse moving outside drifting through the broken window. Lydia set the pistol down carefully and turned to Ethan. It's over, she said, her voice breaking. It's really over. Ethan pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face in his chest, finally letting the tears come. He held her tight, feeling her shake with sobs, and he closed his eyes. It's over, he whispered. You're free. And as the last light of day faded from the Montana sky, Lydia Hale stood in her father's house, her house, and began to believe it. The house felt different in the morning light. Lydia stood at the window of what had been her father's bedroom, watching the sun climb over the eastern ridge, and for the first time in 3 months, she felt like she could breathe. The posse had left before dawn, taking Blackwood and his remaining men to jail in Helena. Marshal Gray had promised to send word about the trial, had shaken her hand with genuine respect, and had told her she'd done something remarkable. But now the house was quiet, and the weight of what came next was settling onto her shoulders. She heard Ethan moving around downstairs, the creak of floorboards and the clatter of pots. He'd stayed the night, insisting he wasn't leaving her alone in a house that still smelled like gunpowder and blood. She'd been too exhausted to argue, and truthfully, she hadn't wanted him to go. His presence had become something solid to hold on to in a world that had tried to tear her apart. Lydia made her way downstairs, her muscles aching from the fight, and found Ethan in the kitchen attempting to make coffee. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the bruise darkening along his jaw, the careful way he moved that told her his ribs were still hurting. Morning, he said. Coffee's almost ready. It might not be good, but it'll be hot. She managed a small smile. That's all I need right now. They sat at the kitchen table together, the same table where she'd eaten breakfast as a child, where her father had taught her to read using old newspapers and a worn Bible. The wood was scarred and faded, but it was still solid. Still here, like her. What happens now? Ethan asked, wrapping his hands around his tin cup. Lydia looked around the kitchen, taking inventory. The windows were broken from the gunfight, the walls pocked with bullet holes. The pantry was nearly empty, the stove needed cleaning, and she could see water damage in the corner where the roof had leaked. Beyond the house, she knew the barn needed repairs. The fences were down in places, and she had no cattle, no horses except the ones Blackwood's men had left behind in their flight. I don't know, she admitted. I have the land back, but I don't have much else. No money for repairs, no livestock, no help. My father's savings went to pay for my schooling back east, and what little was left, Blackwood probably stole. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then he set down his cup and looked at her directly. I've got some money put aside. Not a lot, but enough to buy supplies, maybe hire a few hands for the heavy work. And I've got time. My ranch can wait a few weeks. Ethan, I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering." He leaned forward, his voice steady and sure. "You've been fighting alone for too long, Lydia. Let someone help you." She felt her throat tighten, felt the tears she'd been holding back threatening to spill over again. "Why? Why do you keep doing this for me?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "Because when I heard you screaming in that barn, something in me knew I couldn't walk away. And every day since then, every minute I've spent with you, that feeling's just gotten stronger. You're not a woman who needs saving, Lydia. You're a woman worth standing beside. And if you'll let me, that's exactly what I want to do." The words hung in the air between them, honest and raw. Lydia looked at him, this man who'd risked everything for a stranger, who'd fought beside her, who'd seen her at her worst and hadn't turned away. And she realized that somewhere between the burning barn and this quiet morning, her feelings for him had shifted into something deeper, something that scared her as much as it gave her hope. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "I'd like that very much." Ethan's face broke into a genuine smile, and he reached across the table to take her hand. "Then let's get to work." They spent the morning making a list of everything that needed to be done. The immediate priorities were securing the house and making it livable again, repairing the barn, and assessing what livestock and equipment remained. Ethan rode back to his ranch to gather tools and supplies, promising to return by afternoon, and Lydia set about cleaning the house. She started with the bedroom where the fight had ended, stripping the blood-stained sheets, scrubbing the floor, opening the windows to let fresh air chase away the smell of violence. As she worked, she found herself thinking about her father, about the man who'd built this place with his own hands and had tried to leave her something solid. She wished he could see her now, wished he could know that she'd fought for what was his and won. By the time Ethan returned, she'd cleaned 3 rooms and had started on the kitchen. He brought lumber, nails, glass for the windows, and a box of food supplies from his own pantry. They worked side by side through the afternoon, boarding up the broken windows temporarily, patching holes, making the house secure. It was hard work, physical and exhausting, but there was something satisfying about it too. Something healing. As the sun began to set, they sat on the porch steps together, dirty and tired, sharing a canteen of water. "You know," Ethan said, "I grew up thinking a home was just a place where bad things happened. My father's house was full of shouting and broken furniture and disappointment. I left as soon as I could, and for years I didn't understand why anyone would fight to keep a place like that." He looked out at the darkening prairie, his voice thoughtful. "But this, what you're doing here, I get it now. It's not about the house or the land. It's about what they represent. Roots, belonging, the idea that you can build something and have it last. My ranch taught me that, but watching you fight for this place, that's driven it home in a way I never quite understood before." Lydia rested her head on his shoulder, too tired to worry about propriety. "My father used to say that land remembers. It remembers the hands that worked it, the people who loved it, the sweat and blood that went into making it productive. He said that's why you fight for it, because you're not just fighting for dirt and grass. You're fighting for memory, for legacy, for the idea that your life mattered." He was a wise man. "He was," Lydia agreed softly. "And I'm going to make sure what he built here survives, no matter what it takes." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, and Lydia felt something shift inside her. The fear and anger that had been driving her for months were still there, but they were joined now by something else: determination, purpose, and the quiet certainty that she wasn't facing this alone anymore. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Lydia was in the barn assessing the damage when she heard horses approaching. She grabbed the rifle Ethan had left propped by the door and stepped outside, her heart racing, half expecting Blackwood's men to have returned for revenge. Instead, she found 3 wagons rolling up the drive, driven by families she recognized from Coldwater: Tom and Sarah Mitchell, who ran the general store; the Johnsons, who had a small farm to the east; and old Henry Walsh, who'd known her father since before she was born. Ethan emerged from the house, and together they watched as the families climbed down from their wagons. Sarah Mitchell approached first, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. "Miss Hale," she said, her voice warm, "we heard what happened, heard how you stood up to Blackwood and got your land back. We wanted to come out, see if there was anything we could do to help." Lydia was stunned. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Tom Mitchell said, unloading lumber from his wagon. Your father was a good man, helped a lot of folks when times were hard. We're just returning the favor. For the next 3 days, the families worked alongside Lydia and Ethan, rebuilding and repairing. The men fixed the barn roof, mended fences, and cleared debris. The women cleaned the house from top to bottom, cooked meals, and helped Lydia inventory what was salvageable. The children ran wild in the yard, their laughter filling spaces that had been silent for too long. On the third evening, as everyone was preparing to head home, Henry Walsh pulled Lydia aside. He was a weathered man in his 70s, with kind eyes and hands gnarled from decades of ranch work. Your father would be proud of you, girl, he said quietly. Not just for getting the land back, but for how you did it, with courage and principle. I had help, Lydia said, glancing at Ethan, who was talking with Tom Mitchell by the wagons. Henry followed her gaze and smiled. That Cowboy's a good one. Bit of a loner, keeps to himself mostly, but he's got a solid character. Your father would have liked him. I think so too, Lydia said softly. Henry patted her shoulder. You're going to face some hard times ahead rebuilding this place. If you need anything, advice, labor, even just someone to talk to, you come find me. Your father was like a brother to me, and that makes you family. Tears pricked Lydia's eyes. Thank you, Henry. That means more than you know. After the families left, Lydia and Ethan stood in the yard, surveying what had been accomplished. The house had new windows, the barn was secure, and the fences were mended. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Real, tangible progress. People are good, Lydia said, almost to herself. I'd forgotten that. After everything with Blackwood, after seeing how the sheriff looked the other way and how people stayed silent out of fear, I'd started to think everyone was just out for themselves. But this, she gestured at the house, the barn, everything that had been fixed. This reminds me that most people want to do right. They just need someone to show them it's possible. Ethan nodded. Fear's a powerful thing. Blackwood used it like a weapon, made people afraid to stand up, afraid to speak out. But you broke that. You showed everyone that one person with courage can make a difference. We broke it, Lydia corrected. I couldn't have done any of this without you. He turned to face her, and in the fading light his expression was serious. Lydia, I need to tell you something. These past few days, working here with you, being part of this, it's made me realize something. I don't want to go back to my ranch and pretend this was just a good deed I did for a neighbor. I want to be part of this. Part of what you're building here. Lydia's heart began to race. What are you saying? I'm saying that when I look at this place, I don't just see your father's legacy anymore. I see a future. Our future, if you'll have me. He took her hands in his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other for a short time, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I want to help you rebuild this ranch. I want to stand beside you through whatever comes next. And if you're willing, I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to face anything alone again. Lydia felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they weren't tears of grief or fear. They were tears of joy, of relief, of a happiness she'd almost forgotten was possible. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Ethan, I want that too. He pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face in his chest, feeling his heart beating steady and strong against her cheek. In that moment, standing in the yard of her father's ranch with the stars beginning to appear overhead, Lydia felt something she hadn't felt in years. Home. The weeks that followed were a blur of hard work and slow progress. Ethan moved his essential belongings to the ranch, though he kept his own property and rode over regularly to check on it. They hired 2 ranch hands from Coldwater, young men eager for steady work, and together they began the real work of rebuilding. They repaired the irrigation system that fed the pastures, cleared brush from the creek to ensure good water flow, and started negotiations to buy back some of her father's cattle that had been sold off after his death. Money was tight, but Ethan's savings combined with a small loan from the bank in Helena gave them enough to work with. Marshal Gray sent word that Blackwood's trial was set for early autumn in Virginia City. He'd been charged with Samuel Hale's murder, attempted murder of Lydia, fraud, and half a dozen other crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, Gray wrote, and conviction was all but certain. Lydia took comfort in the news, but she found that her desire for revenge had faded. She wanted justice, yes, but more than that, she wanted to move forward. One evening in late summer, as they were finishing dinner at the kitchen table, Ethan brought up something that had been on his mind. "Have you thought about what you want to do with the silver?" Lydia looked up from her plate, confused. "What silver?" "The silver Blackwood was after. The mineral deposits under the land. Gray mentioned in his letter that the territorial surveyor confirmed it. There's a substantial vein running through the northern section of the property." Lydia set down her fork and was quiet for a long moment. "I've thought about it," she said finally, "and I've decided I don't want to mine it." Ethan's eyebrows rose. "That's a fortune you're walking away from." "Maybe, but it's also what got my father killed. It's what brought Blackwood here, what nearly destroyed this place. If I start mining that silver, what's to stop someone else from trying what Blackwood tried? What's to stop this land from becoming just another mining camp, torn up and ruined in the pursuit of wealth?" She looked out the window at the prairie stretching toward the mountains. "My father built a cattle ranch here. He raised me to respect the land, to work with it instead of just taking from it. If I start digging up that silver, I'm no different than Blackwood. I'm just another person who sees this place as something to be exploited." Ethan was quiet, then he nodded slowly. "I think that's the right choice, and I think your father would be proud of you for making it." "It won't be easy," Lydia admitted. "Building a successful ranch from almost nothing, competing with established operations, making enough to live on. But at least it'll be honest work. At least I'll be able to look at this land and know I didn't destroy it for profit." "Then that's what we'll do," Ethan said simply. "We'll build the best damn cattle ranch in Montana Territory, and we'll do it right." As autumn approached, word came that Blackwood's trial had concluded. He'd been found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. One of his hired men had turned witness, testifying about the plot to kill Samuel Hale, and the forged documents had been exposed for what they were. Justice, slow and imperfect as it was, had been served. Lydia received the news with a quiet sense of closure. She and Ethan rode up to the ridge that overlooked the ranch, the same ridge where she used to sit with her father and watch the sunset. She thought about him now, about the man who'd taught her to ride, to shoot, to stand up for what was right even when it was hard. "I did it, Papa," she said quietly to the wind. "I got our land back, and I'm going to make you proud." Ethan stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, and together they watched the sun sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. The ranch spread out below them, imperfect but theirs, built on honesty and hard work, and the determination to create something that would last. The trial might have ended, but the real work was just beginning. There were cattle to raise, fences to mend, seasons to weather, and a future to build. But for the first time since her father's death, Lydia felt ready to face it all. She wasn't the same woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach in Coldwater 3 months ago, frightened and alone. She'd been tested by fire, had stared down a killer, had fought for what was hers, and won. And standing beside her was a man who'd chosen to stand with her not out of obligation, but out of love. As the last light faded from the sky, Ethan pulled her close and kissed her forehead. Ready to head back? Lydia took one last look at the valley, at the land her father had loved and she'd fought to reclaim, and nodded. Ready. They rode down the ridge together as darkness fell, toward the small house where lamplight glowed in the windows, toward the life they were building together, toward a future that was finally, truly theirs. The next morning brought a letter from the Territorial Land Office, official and stamped with seals that made it look more important than it probably was. Lydia opened it at the breakfast table, her coffee growing cold as she read through the legal language. When she finished, she looked up at Ethan with a mixture of disbelief and triumph. "It's official," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The land is registered in my name. Samuel Hale's daughter, sole owner of 320 acres of Montana Territory. Blackwood's forged deed has been nullified, and all his claims have been dismissed." Ethan came around the table and pulled her to her feet, spinning her in a circle as she laughed, the letter crumpling between them. When he set her down, he was grinning. "You did it," he said. You actually did it. We did it, she corrected, and kissed him. They spent that afternoon writing the property lines, marking boundaries, making plans for where to expand the herd when they had the money, where to dig a new well, where to plant trees for windbreaks. It was practical work, the kind of planning that would take years to fully realize. But it felt good to dream about the future instead of just surviving the present. As they rode, they came across the old barn where everything had started, where Ethan had heard her screaming and had broken down the door to save her life. The structure still bore scorch marks from the fire, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. Lydia dismounted and walked inside, running her hand along the charred wood. I was so scared that night, she said quietly. I thought I was going to die in here, that Blackwood would burn me alive and no one would ever know what really happened. And then I heard you shouting, heard the door breaking open, and I knew I had a chance. Ethan joined her, looking around at the damage. This barn saved your life in a way. If Blackwood had taken you anywhere else, I might not have heard you in time. Should we tear it down? Lydia asked. Build something new? Ethan considered for a moment, then shook his head. No, I think we repair it. Make it stronger than it was before. Let it stand as a reminder that even the worst moments can be survived, that destruction doesn't have to be permanent. Lydia looked at him, and the love she felt was so strong it almost hurt. When did you get so wise? He smiled. Must be the company I keep. They worked on the barn over the next few weeks, replacing burned timbers, reinforcing the structure, installing a new door that opened smooth and easy. It became a symbol of something larger, a testament to resilience and renewal. When they finally finished, they stood back and admired their work. It looks better than before, Lydia said. So do you, Ethan replied, and she knew he wasn't just talking about her appearance. He was talking about the strength she'd found, the courage that had been tested and proven. She'd walked through fire, literally and figuratively, and had come out transformed. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars appear, Lydia found herself thinking about the future in ways she hadn't allowed herself to before. Children running in the yard, the house filled with laughter, a herd of cattle grazing in the pastures, seasons passing one after another in the eternal rhythm of ranch life. It was a future worth fighting for, worth building toward. Ethan, she said suddenly, will you marry me? He turned to look at her, surprise and joy warring on his face. I thought I was supposed to ask you that. Why? Because you're the man? She smiled. I've never been very good at following rules about what women are supposed to do. And I don't want to wait. I don't want to waste any more time. I know what I want, and it's you. It's this life, together. Ethan laughed, a full, genuine sound that she'd come to love. Well, when you put it like that, how can I say no? Yes, Lydia Hale, I'll marry you, on one condition. What's that? That we do it right here, on this land, with everyone who helped us standing witness. I want to start our marriage the same way we've built everything else, with honesty and community and the people we care about around us. Lydia's eyes filled with tears for what felt like the 100th time since this all began, but these were happy tears, tears of a future opening up bright and full of promise. I can't think of anything more perfect. They were married 6 weeks later on a clear October morning, with the mountains standing proud against a blue sky and the prairie grass golden in the autumn sun. Henry Walsh stood up with Ethan, and Sarah Mitchell stood with Lydia. The ceremony was simple, conducted by the circuit judge who happened to be passing through Coldwater, and attended by 36 neighbors who'd come to celebrate. Marshal Gray made the journey from Helena, bringing with him the news that Blackwood had been transferred to the territorial prison and would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. The knowledge brought Lydia a sense of peace, a closing of that dark chapter. After the ceremony, there was music and dancing, food and laughter, and as Lydia danced with her new husband in the yard of her father's ranch, her ranch, their ranch now, she felt a completeness she'd never known before. What are you thinking? Ethan asked, pulling her close. I'm thinking about how much can change in a few months, how I came here broken and angry and lost, and now... She looked around at the celebrating crowd, at the repaired buildings, at the land stretching toward the horizon. Now I have everything I never knew I needed. We're going to build something amazing here, Ethan said. I can feel it. We already have, Lydia replied, and kissed him as the sun climbed higher in the Montana sky. The celebration lasted until well after dark, and when the last guest had departed and they were finally alone, Lydia and Ethan stood together in the doorway of their home, looking out at the land that had tested them both and had ultimately brought them together. "You know," Lydia said thoughtfully, "when I was trapped in that barn, when I thought I was going to die, I kept thinking about all the things I'd never get to do. I'd never get to see my father's ranch restored, never get to fall in love, never get to build a life worth living, and now here I am, having done all of those things." "What changed?" Ethan asked. Lydia turned to look at him. Her husband, her partner, the man who'd heard her screams and had broken down a door to set her free. "You changed everything. You showed me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. You showed me that asking for help isn't weakness, it's strength. And you showed me that the best things in life are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible." Ethan pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "You taught me a few things, too. You taught me that home isn't just a place, it's people. That love isn't something you fall into by accident, it's something you choose every day. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone stand beside you instead of always standing alone." They stood together in the doorway, neither quite ready to go inside and end this perfect day, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead in their ancient dance. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of seasons yet to come. The fight was over. The land was theirs. And the future stretched before them like the Montana prairie, vast and full of possibility, waiting to be claimed by two people who'd learned that freedom wasn't just about breaking chains or winning battles. Real freedom was the ability to choose your own path, to build something meaningful with your own hands, and to stand beside someone who'd chosen to walk that path with you. Lydia Hale had been trapped in a burning barn, had faced down a killer, had fought for her father's legacy, and won. But standing here now, in the doorway of her home with Ethan's arms around her, she realized that the real victory wasn't in defeating Blackwood or reclaiming the land. The real victory was in discovering who she was when everything was stripped away, in finding the strength she didn't know she had, and in choosing to build a future based not on fear or revenge, but on love and hope and the quiet determination to create something that would last. She was free now, truly, completely free. And that freedom tasted sweeter than she'd ever imagined it could. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a fury that tested everything they'd rebuilt. The first snow fell in mid-November, heavy and relentless, blanketing the prairie in white and forcing Lydia and Ethan to work twice as hard to keep the livestock fed and the buildings secure. But they'd prepared well, stockpiling hay and grain, reinforcing the barn, and ensuring every fence line was solid enough to withstand the wind and drifts. On a particularly brutal morning, when the temperature had dropped so low that the water in the trough froze solid within an hour, Lydia stood in the barn feeding the horses and thought about how different this winter was from the last one. A year ago, she'd been in Philadelphia, sitting in warm classrooms and dreaming about a future that seemed safely distant. She'd had no idea her father was dying, no idea that men like Blackwood existed, no idea that she'd soon be fighting for her life and her legacy. Now she was here, her hands rough from work, her body stronger than it had ever been, married to a man who knew her completely and loved her anyway. The contrast was so stark it sometimes took her breath away. "You all right?" Ethan's voice came from the barn door, and she turned to see him stomping snow from his boots, his face red from the cold. "Just thinking," she said, forking hay into the last stall, "about how much has changed." He came to stand beside her, and even through their heavy coats she could feel the warmth of him. "Having regrets?" "Not even one," she said firmly. "Hard as this is, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Would you?" "Not a chance." He kissed her forehead, his lips cold against her skin. "Though I wouldn't mind if winter was a little shorter." They worked together throughout the day, breaking ice, hauling feed, checking on the small herd of cattle they'd managed to purchase. It was exhausting work, the kind that left them both bone-tired by evening, but there was satisfaction in it too. Every animal that survived the winter was a victory. Every storm they weathered together was proof that they could handle whatever came. That night, huddled around the fireplace with hot coffee and a simple dinner, Lydia brought up something she'd been considering for weeks. "I want to expand the herd in spring," she said. "Maybe double what we have now, and I want to try breeding some horses too. Good working horses that other ranchers will want to buy." Ethan looked at her over the rim of his cup, his expression thoughtful. "That's ambitious. We'd need more hands, more equipment, probably another barn." "I know, but we've got the land for it, and if we're smart about it, we could build a real operation here, something that lasts." She set down her plate and leaned forward. "I don't just want to survive, Ethan. I want to thrive. I want to build something my father would be proud of, something that proves Blackwood failed in every way that matters." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. "All right, let's do it. But we do it careful. We don't overextend ourselves, and we make sure we've got enough saved to weather a bad season." "Agreed," Lydia said, and felt excitement building in her chest. This was what she'd been missing since coming back to Montana. This sense of purpose beyond just reclaiming what had been stolen. This was about creating something new, something entirely her own. They spent the long winter evenings planning, sketching out ideas on scraps of paper, calculating costs and potential profits. Ethan taught her things about breeding and bloodlines that her father had never gotten around to, and she taught him the business skills she'd learned back east, how to keep proper books and negotiate deals. They were partners in every sense of the word, each bringing different strengths to the table. By the time the snow began to melt in March, they had a solid plan. They'd buy 20 more head of cattle, invest in a breeding stallion and 3 good mares, hire 2 additional hands for the busy season, and build a smaller secondary barn for the horses. It would stretch their resources thin, but both of them felt it was the right move. The first test came when they went to the bank in Helena to apply for a loan to finance the expansion. The banker, a portly man named Hutchins, who wore a gold watch chain and an expression of perpetual skepticism, listened to their proposal with barely concealed doubt. "Mrs. Cole," he said, managing to make her married name sound like an accusation, "you do understand that ranching is a risky business, particularly for someone with your limited experience?" Lydia felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice level. "I grew up on this ranch, Mr. Hutchins. I know exactly what's involved." "Yes, but running a ranch is quite different from simply living on one. And with your husband's property mortgaged as well, you're asking us to take on considerable risk." "We're not asking for charity," Ethan said, his voice hard. "We're asking for a business loan, backed by 320 acres of prime grazing land and a solid plan for growth. We've brought you 5 years of projected earnings, inventory lists, and references from established ranchers who'll vouch for our competence." Hutchins glanced at the papers they'd prepared, his expression unchanging. "I see you've declined to develop the mineral rights on your property. That seems unwise given the potential value." "That's our decision to make," Lydia said, "and it has nothing to do with our ability to run a successful cattle and horse operation." The banker leaned back in his chair, studying them both. "I'll be frank with you. If Mr. Cole had come in here alone, I'd likely approve this loan without much hesitation. But you're asking me to trust that a woman, however well-intentioned, can manage a ranch through drought, disease, and market fluctuations. That's a risk most banks aren't willing to take." Lydia felt the anger rising in her chest, hot and fierce. "Then most banks are foolish. I survived Cyrus Blackwood, Mr. Hutchins. I exposed his crimes, reclaimed my land, and rebuilt a ranch that he'd tried to destroy. If you don't think that proves I can handle a few market fluctuations, then you're not the kind of banker we want to do business with anyway." She stood, gathering their papers with sharp, precise movements. Ethan rose with her, and they were halfway to the door when Hutchins spoke again. "Wait." They turned. The banker was watching them with a different expression now, something that might have been respect flickering in his eyes. "Sit down," he said. "Let me look at these numbers again." They sat, and this time Hutchins actually read through their projections carefully. He asked intelligent questions about their breeding program, about their market strategy, about how they planned to handle the additional labor needs. And slowly, grudgingly, Lydia saw his attitude shift. "Your numbers are solid," he admitted finally. "And I'll confess, I've heard stories about what happened with Blackwood. The whole territory has. That took considerable courage." He paused, then nodded decisively. I'll approve the loan, but I'll be watching your progress closely, and I expect regular reports on how the expansion is proceeding." Lydia met his eyes steadily. "You'll have them. And Mr. Hutchins, when we're successful, and we will be, I expect you to remember that a woman's determination is just as valuable as a man's when it comes to building something that lasts." Hutchins almost smiled. "I suspect I will, Mrs. Cole. I suspect I will." They walked out of the bank with the loan approved, and Lydia felt like she'd won another battle, smaller than the one with Blackwood, but important in its own way. Every time someone doubted her, every time she had to prove herself again, she was establishing that she belonged here, that she had earned her place. "You were magnificent in there," Ethan said as they walked toward where they'd tied their horses. "I was angry," Lydia corrected. "You were both, and it worked." He helped her into the saddle, then mounted his own horse. But he was right about one thing. People will be watching us, waiting to see if we succeed or fail, some of them hoping for the latter. "Then we'll make sure we succeed," Lydia said simply. "Not because we have something to prove to them, but because we have something to prove to ourselves." The spring work began in earnest once they returned to the ranch. They hired 2 young men from town, brothers named Jack and Danny Morrison, who were eager to learn and willing to work hard. Together, the 5 of them began the enormous task of preparing for the expansion. They built the new barn first, working from dawn until dusk, raising beams and nailing boards while the weather held. It was backbreaking work, and Lydia insisted on doing her share despite Ethan's protests. She wasn't going to be the kind of rancher who gave orders from the porch. If this was going to work, she needed to be in the middle of it, proving to the hired hands that she was as committed as anyone. One afternoon, while they were installing the roof, Jack Morrison called down to her from where he was perched on a beam. "Mrs. Cole, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Lydia said, passing up another bundle of shingles. "Is it true what they say? That you broke into Blackwood's house and stole evidence right out from under his nose?" Lydia glanced at Ethan, who was grinning. "It's true. Though stole isn't quite the right word. Those documents belong to my family. I was just taking back what was mine." "That's incredible," Danny said from his position on the other side of the roof. "My sister didn't believe it when I told her, said no woman would do something that dangerous." "Then your sister underestimates what women are capable of," Lydia said. "Fear doesn't care about gender, and neither does courage. When something needs doing, you do it, regardless of what anyone else thinks is proper or possible." The brothers exchanged glances, and she could see a new respect in their eyes. It occurred to her that she was becoming something of a legend in the territory, the woman who'd stood up to Blackwood and won. She wasn't entirely comfortable with the attention, but if it meant that other women might find the courage to stand up for themselves, then maybe it was worth it. The barn was finished by early May, just in time for the arrival of the new cattle. They came up from Texas in a small drive, 20 head of mixed breeds that Ethan had carefully selected for their hardiness and breeding potential. The horses came a week later, purchased from a breeder in Wyoming who'd heard about their operation and offered them a fair price. The breeding stallion was a magnificent bay named Thunder, with a proud bearing and the kind of strength that promised excellent offspring. The mares were equally impressive, each selected for different qualities that would complement the stallion's strengths. Watching them settle into their new home, Lydia felt a surge of pride and anticipation. This was the beginning of something significant, but with growth came new challenges. The additional animals meant more work, more feed to manage, more fences to maintain. There were days when Lydia fell into bed so exhausted she could barely move, and mornings when getting up felt like an act of will. But she never complained, and neither did Ethan. They'd chosen this path, and they were determined to see it through. Summer brought its own tests. A drought settled over the territory in July, turning the grass brown and lowering the creek to a trickle. Water became precious, rationed carefully between the house, the livestock, and the small vegetable garden Lydia had planted. They hauled water from a spring 2 miles away, working in shifts to keep the troughs filled. One particularly brutal afternoon, after hauling water for hours in 100-degree heat, Lydia sat down in the shade of the barn and simply cried. Not from pain or fear or even frustration, but from sheer exhaustion. She was so tired she could barely think straight, and the relentless sun seemed determined to bake every ounce of moisture from the land. Ethan found her there and sat down beside her, saying nothing, just being present. After a few minutes, Lydia wiped her eyes and laughed shakily. "I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me." "You're tired," Ethan said simply. "We both are. This drought's harder than anything we planned for." "Do you think we made a mistake? Expanding so fast?" He considered the question seriously before answering. "I think we took a calculated risk. And yeah, the drought makes things harder, but we're managing. The animals are healthy, we haven't lost any, and the water's holding out. We're going to make it through this, Lydia. We've survived worse." She leaned against him, drawing strength from his certainty. "You're right. We have survived worse, and we'll survive this too." The drought broke in late August with a thunderstorm that lasted 3 days, flooding the creek and turning the parched earth to mud. They spent 2 days repairing damage from the storm, but the relief of having water again made it all worthwhile. The grass began to recover, and the animals thrived. By the time autumn arrived, they had their first foal, a spirited filly born to one of the mares and sired by thunder. Watching the newborn struggle to its feet on wobbly legs, Lydia felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond words. This was life, literally, created because of the choices they'd made and the work they'd put in. "She's beautiful," she said to Ethan, who was leaning on the stall door beside her. "She is. What should we name her?" Lydia thought for a moment, then smiled. "Freedom. We'll call her Freedom." Ethan understood immediately, and he put his arm around her shoulders. "That's perfect." As fall deepened, they took stock of what they'd accomplished. The herd was thriving, the horses were settling in well, and despite the challenges of drought and storm, they'd managed to turn a small profit. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pay the hired hands, make the loan payment, and put a little aside for winter supplies. More importantly, they'd proven something to themselves and to everyone who doubted them. The Hale Ranch, which Blackwood had tried to destroy and the banker had questioned, was not only surviving, but growing, and it was doing so under Lydia's leadership, with Ethan as her equal partner. The anniversary of her father's death came in October, 3 years since he'd passed, and 1 year since she'd reclaimed the land. Lydia rode up to the small family cemetery on the hill where her father lay buried alongside her mother, who died when Lydia was just a child. She stood at the grave for a long time, telling him everything that had happened, everything they'd built. She told him about Ethan, about the expansion, about the challenges they'd faced and overcome. And she told him she understood now what he'd tried to teach her all those years ago, about the value of land and legacy, and the importance of fighting for what mattered. "I wish you could see it, Papa," she said softly. "I wish you could see what we've done with your ranch. But I think somehow you know. I think you'd be proud." The wind whispered through the grass, and for just a moment Lydia could have sworn she felt her father's presence, approving and at peace. She wiped away a few tears, placed fresh flowers on the grave, and rode back down to the ranch, where Ethan was waiting for her on the porch. "You all right?" he asked as she dismounted. "I am," she said, and meant it. "I really am." That evening, they received an unexpected visitor. Marshal Gray rode up just as they were finishing dinner, looking tired but satisfied. They invited him in, and over coffee he told them the news. "Blackwood's dead," he said without preamble. "Died in prison last week. Some kind of fever that went through the facility. Thought you'd want to know." Lydia absorbed the information quietly. She'd expected to feel something, relief, satisfaction, maybe even vindication. Instead, she felt nothing but a distant sort of closure. "Thank you for telling us," she said. Gray nodded, studying her face. "I half expected you to celebrate." "I don't celebrate death, Marshal, even his. What he did was terrible, and he deserved to pay for it. But I've moved past needing revenge. I'm too busy building a future to dwell on the past." Gray smiled, genuine and warm. "You've come a long way from the frightened woman I met in my office a year ago." "I was never frightened," Lydia corrected gently. "I was angry, desperate, and determined, but not frightened, not really." "My mistake," Gray said, tipping his hat. "And speaking of the future, I heard you're expanding your operation. Talk in Helena is that the Hale Ranch is becoming quite successful." "We're working on it," Ethan said. Takes time to build something solid. Well, keep at it. Montana Territory needs more people like you two, people who aren't afraid to work hard and stand up for what's right. Gray stood, preparing to leave. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me. After he left, Lydia and Ethan sat on the porch in the gathering darkness, watching the stars emerge one by one. Blackwood's really gone, Lydia said, still processing. How do you feel about that? Lighter, she admitted. Like the last shadow hanging over this place has finally lifted. He can't hurt us anymore, can't threaten what we're building. It's really, truly over. And now we get to focus on what comes next, Ethan said. What do you think comes next? He pulled her close, his voice thoughtful. More of this. More hard work, more challenges, more victories. Maybe we expand the house, add on a few rooms. Maybe we hire more hands as the operation grows. Maybe, he paused, then continued carefully. Maybe someday there are children running around this ranch, learning to ride and work and appreciate what we've built here. Lydia felt her heart skip. They'd talked about children in abstract terms, but hearing Ethan say it out loud made it real. You want that? Children? With you? Yes. Someday, when we're ready. I want to build a family here, Lydia. I want to teach our kids the things your father taught you, the things I had to learn on my own. I want them to grow up knowing what it means to work for something, to stand up for what's right, to be part of something bigger than themselves. Tears pricked Lydia's eyes, but they were happy tears. I want that too, all of it. They sat together in the comfortable silence that had become their language, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the horses settling in the barn, the cattle lowing in the distance, the wind moving through the grass. This was home. Not just the land or the buildings, but this moment, this feeling of belonging and purpose and love. The first year of their marriage had been a crucible, testing them in ways they couldn't have anticipated. But they'd come through it stronger, more confident, more deeply connected than ever. The ranch was thriving, the land was theirs, and the future stretched before them like an open trail. Lydia thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, trapped in a burning barn, screaming for help. She thought about how far she'd come, how much she'd grown, how completely her life had transformed. And she thought about the man sitting beside her, the one who'd heard those screams and had crashed through a door to set her free. Freedom, she'd learned, wasn't just about escaping danger or reclaiming stolen property. Real freedom was about choices, about having the power to shape your own destiny and the courage to see it through. She'd chosen to fight for her father's legacy. She'd chosen to trust Ethan. She'd chosen to build rather than to simply survive. And every day she chose to keep moving forward, to keep growing, to keep becoming the woman she was meant to be. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, sensing her mood. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am for you, for this place, for everything we've built together. And I'm thinking that no matter what challenges come next, we'll face them the same way we faced everything else. Together." Ethan kissed her temple, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Together," he agreed. "Always." As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, they finally went inside, to the home they'd restored and the bed they shared, to the life they'd fought for and earned. Outside, the Montana wind sang through the valley, carrying with it the promise of seasons to come, of springs and summers, falls and winters, each one bringing new challenges and new triumphs. The ranch stood solid in the darkness, a testament to resilience and determination, to love and partnership, to the unshakable truth that freedom, once claimed, is worth any price. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the mountains and painted the prairie gold, Lydia and Ethan would rise with it, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that together they could weather any storm. 3 years passed like water flowing over stones, shaping and smoothing everything it touched. The ranch grew steadily, carefully, each season bringing new lessons and new rewards. The herd doubled, then tripled. The horse breeding program became known throughout the territory, with ranchers traveling from as far as Wyoming and Idaho to purchase the strong, intelligent animals that bore the Hale Ranch brand. Jack and Danny Morrison became permanent hands, eventually bringing their younger brother Thomas into the operation as well. The ranch that Lydia's father had built, that Blackwood had tried to destroy, and that Lydia and Ethan had reclaimed, was now one of the most respected operations in Montana Territory. But success, Lydia learned, brought its own complications. On a warm spring morning in their 4th year of marriage, she stood in the expanded barn watching Freedom, now a 3-year-old mare, give birth to her first foal. The birth was difficult, and Lydia had been up all night helping, her hands gentle but firm as she worked to guide the foal into the world. When the colt finally emerged, slick and trembling, she felt the same surge of protective love she'd felt watching Freedom herself being born. "You did good, girl," she murmured to Freedom, stroking the mare's neck as the new mother began cleaning her baby. "You did real good." Ethan appeared in the stall door carrying a steaming cup of coffee. "How's she doing?" "They're both perfect, strong and healthy." Lydia accepted the coffee gratefully, her hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline. "That's the 6th foal this season, all healthy, all good bloodlines." "We're going to need to expand the grazing pastures again," Ethan said, though there was pride in his voice rather than concern. "And probably hire another hand or two." Lydia leaned against him, watching the colt struggle to stand on impossibly long legs. "Remember when we thought managing 20 cattle and 4 horses was overwhelming? I remember you crying in the barn because you were so tired," Ethan said softly. "I remember thinking we might have taken on more than we could handle. And now look at us. 100 head of cattle, 30 horses, 5 full-time workers, and orders backed up for 6 months." She shook her head in wonder. "Sometimes I can't believe this is real." "It's real because you made it real," Ethan said. "Every decision, every risk, every hour of work, that was you refusing to give up on what your father started." Before Lydia could respond, Danny Morrison appeared at the barn entrance, looking concerned. "Mrs. Cole, Mr. Cole, there's someone here to see you. Says it's important." They found a well-dressed woman in her 50s waiting on the porch, sitting primly in one of the chairs with her hands folded in her lap. She stood when they approached, her expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Cole? I'm Margaret Winters from the Helena Women's Society. I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." Lydia exchanged a glance with Ethan, then nodded. "Of course. Would you like some coffee?" Over coffee at the kitchen table, Margaret Winters explained her visit. The Helena Women's Society was organizing a series of public talks about women's roles in building the territory, and they wanted Lydia to be one of their speakers. "Your story has become quite well known," Margaret said. "The young woman who fought to reclaim her family's land, who stood up to a powerful criminal, who's built one of the most successful ranches in the territory. You're an inspiration to women throughout Montana, Mrs. Cole. Many of us would like to hear you speak about your experiences." Lydia felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. I'm not a public speaker, and what I did, well, anyone would have done the same in my position." "That's simply not true, and I think you know it," Margaret said gently. "Most women in your situation would have given up. They would have accepted that the land was lost, that justice was impossible, that standing up to men like Blackwood was too dangerous. But you didn't. You fought and you won, and in doing so, you've shown other women that they have more power than they realize." "She's right," Ethan said quietly. "I've heard the stories, Lydia. Women in Coldwater who stood up to abusive husbands after hearing what you did. A widow in Helena who fought to keep her business when creditors tried to take it. They cite you as their inspiration." Lydia was stunned. She'd been so focused on building the ranch, on day-to-day survival and growth, that she hadn't considered the broader impact of her actions. "I never meant to be an inspiration to anyone," she said slowly. "I just did what I had to do." "And that's exactly why you should speak," Margaret said. "Because you're genuine. You're not someone who set out to make a statement about women's capabilities. You're someone who found herself in an impossible situation and refused to be beaten by it. That authenticity is what makes your story so powerful." Lydia looked at Ethan, who nodded encouragingly. "It's your choice. But I think you'd be good at it, and I think it matters." After a long moment, Lydia nodded. "All right, I'll do it." The speaking engagement was scheduled for early June in Helena, giving Lydia several weeks to prepare. She spent hours thinking about what she wanted to say, drafting notes and practicing in front of Ethan, who offered gentle critiques and constant encouragement. She didn't want to give a speech about female empowerment or political change. She wanted to tell the truth about what had happened, about fear and courage, and the choices that define who we become. The night before the event, As they prepared to ride to Helena, Lydia stood at the window of their bedroom, looking out at the ranch illuminated by moonlight. Ethan came to stand beside her, following her gaze. Having second thoughts? Not about speaking, Lydia said. More like, I'm thinking about how strange it is that the worst night of my life led to all of this. If Blackwood hadn't locked me in that barn, if you hadn't heard me scream, none of this would exist. We wouldn't be married, the ranch wouldn't have grown, my father's legacy would have been lost forever. You think everything happens for a reason? Ethan asked. Lydia considered the question. I think terrible things happen, and we get to choose what we do with them. Blackwood tried to destroy me, but I chose to fight back. I chose to trust you. I chose to rebuild rather than run away. The meaning isn't in what happened to me. It's in what I did with it afterward. Ethan pulled her close. That's what you should say tomorrow. That's the message people need to hear. The speaking event was held in the Grand Hall of Helena's finest hotel, and Lydia was shocked to find over 200 people crowded into the space, most of them women, but a fair number of men as well. She stood backstage, her hands sweating and her heart racing, listening to Margaret Winters introduce her. And now it's my great honor to present Mrs. Lydia Cole, a woman whose courage and determination have made her a legend throughout Montana Territory. The applause was thunderous. Lydia stepped onto the stage, temporarily blinded by the lamps, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Then she saw Ethan in the front row, his face calm and confident, and she remembered why she was here. She told them the truth. She told them about returning home to find her father dead and her land stolen. She told them about being locked in a burning barn, about screaming for help and not knowing if anyone would come. She told them about Ethan breaking down the door, about the fight to reclaim what was hers, about standing in Blackwood's office with a gun in her hand while he mocked her courage. I was terrified every step of the way, she said, her voice carrying through the silent hall. I'm not fearless. I'm not particularly brave. I'm just stubborn. And I was raised to believe that when something is yours, when it's right, you fight for it. My father taught me that. He taught me that land remembers who loves it, and that the greatest legacy we can leave is not wealth or property, but the example of standing up for what matters. She talked about the challenges of rebuilding, about droughts and doubts, and the banker who'd questioned whether a woman could run a ranch. She talked about the support she'd received from neighbors, about Ethan's partnership, about learning that asking for help wasn't weakness, but wisdom. Some of you have heard my story and called me brave, she said. But bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's being absolutely terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. It's standing up even when your knees are shaking. It's refusing to accept that your life is something that happens to you rather than something you create. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces, and saw women crying, saw men nodding in agreement, saw young girls watching her with wide, hopeful eyes. I don't know what battles you're facing. I don't know what doors you need to break down or what fires you need to survive. But I do know this. You're stronger than you think. You're braver than you believe. And you deserve to fight for the life you want, regardless of what anyone else says is proper or possible. Don't wait for someone to save you. Don't wait for permission to stand up for yourself. Break down your own doors. Set yourself free. The applause started before she finished, building to a roar that shook the rafters. Women stood, many openly weeping, and the ovation continued for what felt like an eternity. Lydia stood on that stage, overwhelmed and humbled, realizing that her story had become bigger than just her own experience. It had become a symbol of possibility, proof that change was achievable, that women could be more than what society told them they should be. Afterward, dozens of women approached her, wanting to shake her hand, to tell her their own stories, to thank her for giving them courage. One young woman, barely 18, gripped Lydia's hands tightly and said, I was going to give up on my dream of becoming a teacher. My father said it was foolish, that I should just get married. But after hearing you speak, I'm going to fight for it. I'm going to prove him wrong. Lydia hugged her fiercely. Good. Fight for it. And don't let anyone tell you that your dreams are less important than theirs. On the ride back to the ranch the next day, Lydia was quiet, processing everything that had happened. Ethan let her think, understanding that she needed time to absorb the magnitude of what her story had become. Finally, as they crested the ridge overlooking their land, Lydia spoke. I never wanted to be famous. I never wanted to be anyone's hero. I know, Ethan said, but maybe it matters anyway. Maybe if my story can help even one woman find the courage to change her life, then everything I went through was worth it. It was worth it regardless, Ethan said firmly, because you survived, because you're here, living the life you fought for. That alone makes it worth it. They rode down toward the ranch house, where smoke curled from the chimney and the Morrison brothers were working with the horses in the corral. This was home, Lydia thought. This was what she'd fought for and won. Not just the land, but the life built on it, the partnership with Ethan, the knowledge that she'd taken something broken and made it whole again. As summer deepened, Lydia received more invitations to speak, but she declined most of them. She had a ranch to run, a life to live, and she'd said what she needed to say. Her legacy, she decided, wouldn't be as a public figure or a symbol. It would be in the land itself, in the ranch that would outlast her, in the example she set through actions rather than words. In July, she discovered she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, through missed courses and morning sickness, through a fatigue that felt different from the exhaustion of ranch work. When she finally allowed herself to believe it, she sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, trying to comprehend that a new life was growing inside her. She told Ethan that evening, unable to wait any longer. He was grooming Thunder in the barn when she found him, and the words tumbled out before she could think about how to say them properly. I'm pregnant. Ethan froze, the brush suspended in mid-stroke. Then he set it down carefully and turned to face her, his expression transforming from shock to wonder to pure, unfiltered joy. You're sure? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm sure. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides and swept her into his arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around while she laughed and cried simultaneously. When he set her down, his hands were shaking as he cupped her face. We're going to have a baby, he said, as if he needed to hear himself say it to believe it. We're going to have a baby, Lydia confirmed, and kissed him. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into fall. Lydia continued working on the ranch, though she gradually handed off the heavier tasks to the hired hands. Ethan became impossibly protective, worrying about her constantly, trying to convince her to rest more than she wanted to. I'm pregnant, not fragile, she told him one afternoon when he tried to stop her from climbing onto a horse. Women have been having babies while running ranches since ranches were invented. I'll be fine. I know, He struggled for words. I want to take care of you. Both of you. Lydia softened, taking his hand and placing it on her swelling belly. You do take care of us. But you also have to trust that I know my own limits. I'll ask for help when I need it. I promise. As winter approached, they prepared the house for the baby's arrival. Ethan built a beautiful cradle from cherry wood, carving intricate designs into the headboard. Sarah Mitchell and other women from town organized a gathering, bringing clothes and blankets and advice. The ranch, which had always been a place of work and struggle, began to feel like something else, a home preparing to welcome new life. Lydia spent the long winter evening sitting by the fire, knitting small clothes and thinking about the future. She thought about her father, about how much she wished he could meet his grandchild. She thought about her mother, whose face she could barely remember but whose strength she'd inherited. And she thought about the woman she'd been 4 years ago, trapped in a burning barn, screaming for help. That woman felt like a stranger now. So much had changed, not just externally but internally. She'd discovered strengths she never knew she possessed, had learned that courage wasn't something you were born with but something you chose in moments of crisis. She'd built a life from ashes and fear, had transformed pain into purpose, had proven that the worst moments could lead to the best outcomes if you refused to surrender to them. The baby came in late February during a snowstorm that closed the roads and kept the doctor in town. Sarah Mitchell and another experienced midwife named Ellen Hart came to help, and Lydia labored through the night while the wind howled outside and Ethan paced the kitchen, wearing a path in the floorboards. The pain was intense, overwhelming at times, but Lydia drew on everything she'd learned over the past 4 years about endurance and determination. When the midwife told her to push, she pushed. When her body screamed for rest, she found the strength to continue. And when dawn broke over the mountains and she heard her baby's first cry, She felt a completion so profound it took her breath away. "It's a girl," Sarah said, her voice choked with emotion. "A beautiful, perfect girl." They placed the baby in Lydia's arms, and she looked down at the tiny face, the dark hair, the eyes that would eventually turn the same hazel as her father's. This was her daughter, the next generation of Hale women, a living legacy that meant more than any amount of land or cattle or success. Ethan was allowed in moments later, and he approached the bed with tears streaming down his face. Lydia had never seen him cry before, not through all their struggles and triumphs, but he was crying now, overcome with the magnitude of what they'd created together. "She's perfect," he whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "She looks like you." "She has your nose," Lydia said, smiling through her own tears. "What should we name her?" They'd discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never settled on one. Now, looking at their daughter's face, Lydia knew exactly what felt right. "Grace," she said. "Grace Hannah Cole. Grace for the blessing she is, and Hannah for my mother." "Grace," Ethan repeated, testing the name. "I love it." The baby opened her eyes and looked up at them, seeing her parents for the first time, and Lydia felt the world shift on its axis. Everything she'd fought for, everything she'd built, suddenly had new meaning. She wasn't just preserving her father's legacy anymore. She was creating one for her daughter, building a foundation on which Grace could build her own life. Spring arrived with the usual chaos of new life. The ranch thrived. Grace grew stronger every day, and Lydia slowly returned to her regular work, though now with a baby strapped to her back and a carrier Ellen had shown her how to make. She'd seen Native women carrying their babies this way and had adopted the practice, finding it allowed her to work while keeping Grace close. The image of Lydia Cole working her ranch with a baby on her back became iconic in the territory. Artists sketched it, newspapers wrote about it, and women throughout Montana took note. Here was proof that motherhood and capability weren't mutually exclusive, that women could be both nurturing and strong, both feminine and powerful. On a warm day in May, when Grace was 3 months old and the prairie was painted with wildflowers, Lydia carried her daughter up to the family cemetery. She knelt beside her father's grave, adjusting Grace in her arms so the baby could see. "Papa, this is your granddaughter, Grace," she said softly. "I wish you could have met her. I wish you could see everything we've built here." She paused, emotion thick in her throat. "I want you to know that I understand now what you tried to teach me, about legacy and land, about fighting for what matters, about building something that lasts. This ranch, this life, it's not just about cattle and horses and profit. It's about creating something good and true that can be passed down through generations." She looked out at the ranch spread below them, at the house and barns, at the grazing animals and green pastures, at Ethan working with the Morrison brothers in the corral. "I'm going to teach Grace the same things you taught me, how to work hard, how to stand up for herself, how to be brave even when she's terrified. But I'm also going to teach her things you never got the chance to teach me, that asking for help is strength, not weakness, that love is as important as determination, that the best legacy isn't what you leave behind, but how you treat people while you're here." Grace made a small sound, and Lydia looked down at her daughter's face, at the innocent eyes that would someday see all the complexity and beauty of the world. She thought about everything this child would experience, about the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead, about the woman she would become. "I hope I can be half the parent to you that my father was to me," she whispered to Grace. "And I promise you this, no matter what happens, no matter what storms come, I will fight to give you a world where you're free to be whoever you want to be, where your worth isn't determined by your gender, where your dreams aren't limited by other people's expectations. You're going to grow up knowing that you're strong, capable, and deserving of every opportunity." The years that followed were full and rich, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the milestones of Grace's growth. The little girl learned to walk on the porch her grandfather had built, learned to ride on horses her mother had bred, learned about courage and determination from watching her parents work side by side as equals. When Grace was 5, another daughter arrived, whom they named Clara after Ethan's grandmother. 2 years after that, a son they called Samuel for Lydia's father. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family, and the ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the most successful operations in what was now the state of Montana, having achieved statehood when Grace was 7. Lydia never spoke publicly again after that one event in Helena, but her influence continued to spread through her actions. She hired women when other ranchers wouldn't, paid fair wages regardless of gender, and mentored young women who wanted to learn about ranching and business. The Hale Ranch became known not just for its quality livestock, but for its progressive practices and commitment to fair treatment. On a fall evening 20 years after that night in the burning barn, Lydia and Ethan sat on the porch watching the sunset, just as they had countless times before. Their children were inside, Grace, now a young woman of 19, helping with dinner, Clara practicing piano, and Samuel reading by lamplight. The ranch hummed with life and purpose, 3 generations of work visible in every fence post and building. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Ethan asked. "If I hadn't heard you that night? If I'd ignored it? If Blackwood had succeeded?" Lydia was quiet for a moment, then shook her head. "I try not to dwell on alternate histories. What matters is what did happen, the choices we made, the life we built." "Any regrets?" She looked at him, this man who'd aged alongside her, whose face showed the marks of hard work and laughter, whose hands bore scars from a lifetime of labor, whose eyes still looked at her with the same love and respect they had 2 decades ago. "Not one," she said firmly. "It's been hard, harder than I ever imagined it could be. But every struggle, every challenge, every moment of doubt, it all led to this. To our children, our home, our legacy. I'd do it all again without changing a single thing." Ethan took her hand, his grip still strong despite the years. "We built something remarkable here, Lydia, something that'll outlast us both." "We did," she agreed. "But more than that, we proved something. We proved that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and choosing to act anyway. We proved that the worst moments can become the foundation for the best life. And we proved that freedom isn't something given to you, it's something you claim for yourself, something you fight for and protect and pass down to your children." As if summoned by her words, Grace appeared in the doorway, her face so much like Lydia's at that age that it sometimes took her breath away. "Mama, Papa, dinner's ready. And Mama, I wanted to ask you something." Grace came to sit on the porch railing, her expression serious. "I've been thinking about my future, about what I want to do with my life." "And?" Lydia prompted. "I want to stay here. I want to learn everything about running this ranch. And someday, I want to take over. I want to continue what you and Grandfather started, what you've spent your life building." She paused, then added, "But I also want to expand it. I want to start a program to teach other young women about ranching and business, to show them they can do this too. I want to help other women find the kind of freedom and purpose you've found." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of pride and joy. Her daughter had inherited not just the land, but the values, the determination, the commitment to helping others that had defined Lydia's own journey. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I'll help you any way I can." That night, after the children had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Lydia stood at the window of her bedroom, looking out at the ranch bathed in moonlight. She thought about that terrified young woman who'd returned from Philadelphia, expecting to reclaim her inheritance, and instead had found herself locked in a burning barn, facing death and defeat. She thought about the scream that had torn from her throat, the desperate plea for help that had changed everything. And she thought about the man who'd heard it, who'd broken down a door and declared her free, not knowing that freedom was just the beginning of the story. 20 years ago, Ethan had set her free from that barn. But over the years that followed, she'd set herself free from so much more. From doubt, from fear, from the limitations others tried to impose, from the idea that her life was something that happened to her rather than something she created. She'd taken the worst night of her life and transformed it into a catalyst for change, for growth, for building something meaningful. The ranch her father had started, that Blackwood had tried to destroy, that she and Ethan had rebuilt and expanded, would continue long after they were gone. Grace would run it, and her children after her, each generation adding their own chapter to the story. But the real legacy wasn't the land or the buildings, or even the successful business. The real legacy was the example, the proof that one person's courage could ripple outward, affecting not just their own life, but the lives of countless others. Every woman who'd heard Lydia's story and found the strength to stand up for herself, every girl who grew up believing she could do anything she set her mind to, every person who learned that asking for help was strength rather than weakness, they were all part of that legacy. Ethan came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Lydia said softly. "About that night in the barn, about all the years since, about Grace wanting to continue what we've built, about how one moment of terror became the beginning of the best life I could have imagined." "Do you ever wonder what you'd tell that woman, the one trapped in the barn?" Lydia considered the question seriously. "I'd tell her that she's stronger than she knows, that the fear she's feeling won't last forever, that help is coming, but more importantly, that she has the strength to save herself. I'd tell her that the darkest moments don't define us, our response to them does. And I'd tell her that freedom isn't just about escaping danger, it's about choosing, every single day, to build a life worth living." They stood together in the moonlight, looking out at the land that had witnessed so much struggle and triumph, loss and love, fear and courage. 20 years ago, Cyrus Blackwood had tried to destroy Lydia Hale. Instead, he'd inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that proved what she'd always suspected, that the human spirit, when pushed to its limits, could not only survive, but thrive. The barn where it all started still stood on the northern edge of the property, repaired and reinforced, serving as a stable for their best breeding horses. Sometimes Lydia would go there and stand in the doorway, remembering that night, feeling again the terror and desperation of being trapped, but mostly what she felt was gratitude, for Ethan's courage, for her own resilience, for every person who'd helped them build this life. As they finally turned away from the window and prepared for bed, Lydia took one last look at the moonlit prairie. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new opportunities. The ranch would continue, her children would grow, and life would unfold in all its messy, beautiful complexity. But tonight, standing in the home she'd fought for with the man who'd stood beside her through everything, Lydia Cole felt something she'd earned through blood and tears and unshakable determination: peace. The kind of peace that comes not from the absence of struggle, but from knowing you've faced the worst and emerged stronger. The kind of peace that comes from looking at your life and knowing that every scar, every battle, every moment of fear was worth it because of what you built in spite of it all. She was free. Truly, completely, eternally free. And that freedom, claimed not given, fought for not inherited, was the greatest legacy she could leave behind.